Imagine being the CEO of a massive company, walking past hundreds of employees every day until one night, you notice something off. A hard-working employee, always exhausted, always staying late, but where does he go after work? When the CEO secretly follows him, what he uncovers is shocking, heartbreaking, and just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Stay with us, because this story is one you won't forget. Richard Blake had always prided himself on understanding the pulse of his company. As the CEO of Evermart, one of the largest retail chains in the region, he knew that a company wasn't just built on numbers and profit margins, it was built on people. And if something felt off among his employees, it meant there was a problem worth addressing. Lately, Richard had noticed a subtle shift in the energy of his night shift crew at the downtown Evermart location. The usual camaraderie and steady workflow seemed strained. Productivity reports showed minor declines, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to catch his attention. It was during one of his routine late-night visits that he started paying closer attention to the employees working after hours. That was when he first noticed Mark Evans. Mark was one of those employees that every manager wanted, hardworking, reliable, never late, never complained. He moved with quiet efficiency, stocking shelves and handling last-minute customer needs with a calm demeanor. But something about him stood out. He was always the last to leave. Even when his shift ended, his posture seemed tense, shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. And, more noticeably, he looked exhausted, deeply, persistently exhausted. At first, Richard dismissed it as normal wear and tear from working odd hours. The night shift was tough, after all, but as weeks passed, he realized Mark never seemed to recover. Dark circles under his eyes became more pronounced. His uniform looked a little more wrinkled than the others. And while most employees took their breaks to chat or relax, Mark usually sat alone, eating something quick and basic, like he was rationing meals. One night, as Richard was leaving after a late meeting, he caught sight of Mark again. His shift had ended nearly 30 minutes ago, but instead of heading out like everyone else, Mark lingered near the exit before making his way to the parking lot. Something about his slow, deliberate movements struck Richard as unusual. Curious, Richard paused near the glass windows of his office, watching as Mark made his way across the dimly lit parking lot. Instead of unlocking his car and driving away like any other employee, Mark opened the driver's side door, slid into the seat, and simply sat there, no engine starting, no movement, just sitting in the dark. Richard frowned. He checked his watch. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Mark still hadn't moved. A nagging feeling settled in the back of Richard's mind. Something wasn't right. He didn't act on it immediately. Maybe Mark was just unwinding after a long shift. Maybe he had a lot on his mind. But something about the stillness, the way Mark seemed reluctant to leave, stayed with Richard long after he'd driven home that night. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling in his mind. Why was Mark sitting alone in his car, in the dark, long after his shift had ended? Richard had built his career by trusting his instincts. And right now, his instincts told him there was more to this than met the eye. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something about Mark Evans wasn't adding up. The man worked harder than most employees, never missed a shift, yet carried a fatigue that seemed deeper than simple exhaustion. Over the next few days, Richard paid closer attention. He wasn't one to micromanage, but he knew that sometimes the smallest details revealed the biggest truths. What he found only deepened his curiosity. Despite consistently staying late and covering extra shifts, Mark had never accepted overtime pay. Evermart's payroll system flagged him as eligible for bonuses multiple times, but he had never once filled out the necessary forms. That alone was strange. Most employees took whatever extra compensation they could get. Even more puzzling, when Richard checked Mark's personnel file, he noticed something odd. Instead of a standard home address, Mark had listed only a P.O. box. No apartment, no house. That night, after a board meeting ran late, Richard decided to stay behind and see for himself. He positioned himself near the large front windows of the store as the last few employees clocked out. Mark was among them. As the others walked toward their cars and drove away, Mark took his time, lingering near the entrance as if waiting for something. Then, slowly, He made his way toward the parking lot. Richard followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. It wasn't something he typically did. Spying on employees felt invasive, but something told him this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. Mark reached an old sedan parked at the farthest end of the lot. The car was worn, its paint chipping in places, a dent visible on the rear bumper. Richard expected to see him start the engine and drive off. Instead, Mark opened the driver's side door, ducked inside, and stayed there. No lights, no movement. Frowning, Richard moved closer, keeping to the shadows. From his vantage point, he could just make out Mark's silhouette through the windshield. The man wasn't just sitting, he was settling in. After a moment, he reached into the backseat, pulled out what looked like a rolled-up sleeping bag, and unfolded it across the passenger seat. Richard inhaled sharply. Mark wasn't going home. This car was his home. The realization hit him like a weight in his chest. He watched as Mark shifted in his seat, pulling a jacket over himself as if it were a blanket. A small stack of canned food sat on the passenger side floor, alongside a duffel bag filled with clothes. It was a setup meant for survival, not comfort. For a long moment, Richard just stood there, caught between two conflicting instincts. One part of him told him to turn away, to respect the man's privacy. Everyone had their struggles, and maybe Mark didn't want anyone interfering in his. But another part of him, the part that had built Evermart from the ground up, the part that believed a company was only as strong as the people behind it, told him he couldn't just ignore what he'd seen. Determined to understand more, he took out his phone and began searching. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Mark Evans, former U.S. Army, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, honorably discharged 5 years ago. The records didn't reveal much beyond that, but Richard knew enough about veterans to recognize the pattern. Many struggled after leaving the service, some adjusted, some didn't. If Mark had no permanent address and was living out of his car, it likely meant his transition back to civilian life had not been smooth. And if Mark was struggling, how many others at Evermart were in the same position? The thought unsettled him. Richard slipped his phone back into his pocket, casting one last look toward Mark's car. The man was already lying down, his eyes closed, as if trying to steal a few hours of restless sleep before another long shift. Richard turned and walked away, his mind made up. Tomorrow, he was going to talk to Mark. One way or another, he was going to find out the truth. Richard had spent the entire day distracted, his mind circling back to the image of Mark curled up in his car the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just bad luck or a rough patch. Something deeper was going on, and he needed to understand it. By the time the last shift ended, Richard was already waiting in the dimly lit parking lot, leaning casually against his car. He watched as the store lights flickered off one by one, and employees trickled out, chatting quietly among themselves before heading home. Mark was the last to leave. As always, he stepped outside, his posture tense, eyes flicking around as if checking for something. When he spotted Richard standing near the entrance, his steps slowed. Mark didn't change direction, but there was a shift in his expression, a flicker of something guarded. He adjusted the strap of his work bag over his shoulder and kept walking toward his car. Richard pushed off his car and closed the distance between them. "Got a minute?" Mark hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Sure." His voice was steady, but his grip tightened slightly on the bag he was carrying. Richard motioned toward the parking lot. "I was here late last night. Saw you sitting in your car for a while. You weren't just resting, were you?" Mark's jaw tensed. His eyes darted toward his car, then back to Richard. "I appreciate the concern, but it's nothing." Richard sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but I can't ignore what I saw." Mark shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "With all due respect, Mr. Blake, I just work here. Whatever's going on with me, it's got nothing to do with my job." Richard studied him for a long moment. "Maybe not, but I built this company believing that people matter. Not just as employees, but as human beings. And right now, it looks like one of my people is struggling." Mark exhaled, a long, measured breath. "I get it, but I don't need help. I can handle it." "You're sleeping in your car," Richard said plainly. "That doesn't look like handling it to me." For the first time, Mark's expression flickered with something raw, embarrassment. Maybe even frustration. He looked away, his shoulders stiff. "I don't take handouts," he said quietly. "This isn't about charity," Richard said. "It's about making sure someone who works hard every day doesn't have to live like this." Mark let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You think you're the first person to offer? I've heard it all before. Shelters, temp housing, government assistance. You know what happens when people find out you don't have a home? They start treating you different. Like you're broken, like you can't be trusted." He met Richard's gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not a charity case. I'm just trying to get by." Richard recognized that tone. It wasn't just pride, it was survival. Mark wasn't just refusing help, he was protecting himself from something. "Then tell me why," Richard said. "You served in the military. You worked hard enough to be one of my most reliable employees. So why are you here? What happened?" Mark's face remained impassive, but his grip on his bag tightened. "That's personal." Richard nodded slowly. "Fair enough." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken things. "At least let me help you find a place to stay," Richard offered. "Just temporarily, until you figure things out." Mark shook his head. "I appreciate it, really, but I'm fine." Richard exhaled, realizing he wasn't going to get anywhere by pushing. "All right," he said, "but if you ever change your mind, my door's open." Mark gave him a small nod, the closest thing to gratitude he'd allow himself. As he turned to walk toward his car, Richard started heading back to his own, but then something caught his eye. Across the lot, near the farthest row of parked cars, a figure stood partially hidden in the shadows. A man, watching. Richard slowed his steps, instincts kicking in. The man wasn't just loitering. His stance was deliberate, his gaze fixed in Mark's direction. Mark, however, must have noticed too. He stiffened, adjusting his bag, but kept his eyes forward, deliberately avoiding the man's gaze as he unlocked his car. He moved quickly, slipping inside and starting the engine without hesitation. Richard turned back toward the stranger. But just as he did, the man stepped further into the darkness and disappeared behind the building. Something was definitely going on. Richard sat in his office, staring at the dim glow of his computer screen. The conversation with Mark had left more questions than answers, and the image of the man lurking in the shadows still unsettled him. Something was off, something deeper than just bad luck or financial struggles. Mark was carrying a weight that went beyond his current situation, and Richard needed to understand what it was. He tapped his fingers against the desk before finally opening his email. If he was going to get to the truth, he needed help. Minutes later, his assistant, Linda, knocked on the door. She was efficient, sharp, and had a talent for uncovering details most people missed. Richard explained what he needed: background information on Mark Evans. Nothing invasive, just the public records. By the time lunch rolled around, Linda returned with a file in hand. "Mark Evans, 36 years old," she said, placing it on his desk. "Served in the U.S. Army for nearly a decade. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Ranked staff sergeant before he was discharged." She hesitated on the last word. Richard flipped through the pages. "Dishonorable?" "No," Linda said. "Technically, it was an administrative separation. Not dishonorable, not exactly honorable either. It's unusual." Richard scanned the paperwork, noting the lack of details. For someone with Mark's record, there should have been commendations, service recognitions, something. Instead, the last few years of his military career were vague, as if scrubbed clean. "What happened after he left?" Richard asked. Linda shook her head. "That's the thing. There's almost nothing. No steady employment, no fixed address. He just disappeared." Richard leaned back, his mind piecing things together. Mark wasn't just struggling, he had been erased. There was only one place that might have the answers he needed. Later that afternoon, Richard drove across town to the Veterans Outreach Center, a modest building tucked between a row of aging businesses. It wasn't fancy, but it was a place where former soldiers could find resources, job assistance, or just someone who understood. Inside, a man in his early 40s was sorting through paperwork at the reception desk. He had a solid build, short-cropped hair graying at the temples, and a quiet intensity in his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen more than he cared to. "David Carter," Richard had looked him up before coming. A former Army captain, now dedicating his time to helping veterans adjust to civilian life. David glanced up as Richard approached. "You don't look like a veteran," he said, studying him. "I'm not," Richard admitted, extending a hand. "Richard Blake, CEO of Evermart." David raised an eyebrow. "You here to make a donation or?" "I need information," Richard said, "about a man named Mark Evans." David's expression shifted. He didn't confirm or deny knowing Mark, but his posture stiffened. "What's this about?" "He works for me," Richard said, choosing his words carefully, "and I think he's in trouble." David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, that sounds about right." He gestured to a set of chairs in the waiting area. "Come on, let's talk." Once they were seated, David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mark and I served together. Good soldier, smart, loyal, but things went south fast." Richard waited, sensing there was more. "There was an operation," David continued. "We were stationed in a region where supplies were supposed to be coming in regularly, food, medical gear, fuel, but things kept going missing. At first, it seemed like clerical errors, miscommunication. Then Mark started digging." David exhaled sharply. "Turns out, it wasn't a mistake. Someone high up was skimming, selling military supplies on the black market. Mark found evidence, real evidence. He tried to report it, but before he could go up the chain of command, things shifted." Richard's grip tightened on the armrest. "What do you mean?" "He was set up," David said, his voice hard. "Charges of misconduct, insubordination. They didn't court-martial him, they didn't have to. They pushed him out, made it impossible for him to fight back. And once he was out, they made sure he stayed down. Blacklisted, no security jobs, no defense contracts, no way back in." Richard felt a cold anger settle in his chest. "And now he's living in his car." David nodded grimly. "Yeah, because when they take everything from you, that's all that's left." Richard sat back, exhaling slowly. He had come here looking for answers, but what he had found was something much bigger. Mark wasn't just a struggling veteran. He was a man who had tried to do the right thing and had been destroyed for it. This wasn't just about giving Mark a place to stay. This was about justice. Richard sat in his car outside the Evermart parking lot, the engine off, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The night was cold, the air crisp enough to see his breath fog up the windshield. He had spent the entire day turning over what he had learned from David Carter, piecing together the fragments of Mark's past. What had started as a simple concern for an employee had morphed into something much bigger. He needed to talk to Mark again. When the last few employees filtered out of the store, Richard spotted him. Mark walked with the same quiet determination, shoulders slightly hunched, moving quickly as if hoping to leave unnoticed. But tonight, Richard wasn't going to let him. As Mark reached his car, Richard stepped out of his own. "We need to talk." Mark froze mid-step but didn't turn around. His grip on his keys tightened before he finally sighed and faced Richard. "Look, Mr. Blake, I appreciate your concern, but I already told you, I'm fine." "No, you're not," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "I know about Afghanistan. I know what happened, or at least, I know enough to realize this isn't just about bad luck." Mark's entire body stiffened, his eyes darkened with something sharp, anger, maybe even fear. "You had no right to dig into my past." "Maybe not," Richard admitted, "but you work for me. And I don't turn a blind eye when someone on my team is being forced to live in a parking lot." Mark clenched his jaw, his breath shallow. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he asked, "How much do you know?" Richard didn't back down. "Enough to understand that you tried to do the right thing. That you uncovered something you weren't supposed to. That instead of justice, you got silence." Mark looked away, his hands tightening into fists. "It's over," he muttered. Richard shook his head. "I don't think it is." Before Mark could respond, a voice cut through the night air. Well, some people never learn." Both men turned. A figure emerged from the shadows near the side of the building. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that did little to soften his presence. His face was partially obscured by the dim lighting, but Richard could make out a scar along his jawline and eyes that were locked on Mark with a predatory sharpness. Mark went completely still. The man took another step closer. Hands in his pockets. His posture deceptively relaxed. I told you to stay buried. Evans. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with an unmistakable threat. Richard instinctively moved closer to Mark. But Mark didn't acknowledge him. His breathing had slowed, his stance shifting slightly, like a soldier preparing for a hit. I don't know what you think you're doing. The man continued, tilting his head, but I'd suggest you rethink it. Quickly. Mark's voice, when he spoke, was quiet but steady. I'm not doing anything. The man let out a dry chuckle. Then keep it that way. His gaze flicked briefly to Richard, as if only now registering his presence. And you, I'd be careful who you decide to play hero for. Richard didn't flinch. Who are you? The man smirked. Someone who doesn't want to have this conversation again. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the shadows, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had arrived. Richard exhaled, glancing at Mark, who still hadn't moved. His face was unreadable, but his hands were shaking ever so slightly. Richard folded his arms. Still think it's over? Mark swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand. These people, they don't just make problems disappear. They erase them. He turned to face Richard fully, his expression torn between exhaustion and something deeper, resignation. They didn't just destroy my life. They made sure I couldn't rebuild it. And they'll do the same to anyone who tries. Richard studied him for a long moment before speaking. Then let's make sure they don't get the chance. Mark looked at him, something flickering in his eyes. Not quite trust, not yet, but for the first time. He didn't look away. Richard leaned against his desk, phone pressed to his ear as he listened to the steady ringing. He had spent the morning debating whether or not to make this call. But after what had happened the night before, there was no turning back. David Carter picked up on the third ring. Blake, his voice came through, rough but alert. Didn't expect to hear from you again this soon. I need more information, Richard said. The people Mark went up against. Who exactly are they? David sighed. I figured you'd ask that. There was a pause. Then the sound of papers shuffling in the background. It wasn't just a few corrupt officers skimming supplies. The whole operation was backed by a private defense contractor, Horizon Group. They handle military logistics, supply distribution, you name it. Mark found evidence that they were inflating prices on contracts, selling second-rate gear at premium costs, and pocketing the difference. Richard frowned. And no one stopped them? David let out a dry laugh. You don't stop people like them. Blake, you either work for them, or you disappear. When Mark blew the whistle, they made sure his career ended before he could take it any higher. Richard rubbed a hand over his face. A corporation with ties to the government, profiting from fraud, and silencing anyone who got too close. This wasn't just a veteran's bad luck. This was a machine built to protect itself. They're watching him, Richard said. Last night, someone confronted him, knew exactly who he was, made it clear he was supposed to stay buried. David's voice dropped. Then you need to be careful. These people don't play games. Richard was about to respond when a sharp beep interrupted him. His office security system had detected a breach. He pulled the phone away, checking the monitor on his desk. Someone had accessed Evermart's internal network. Damn it, he muttered. What's wrong? David asked. Richard typed quickly, pulling up the log files. Someone just tapped into my company's security system. He checked the activity history. An external user had tried to access employee records. Not just any records. Mark's file. Richard's stomach tightened. They're looking for him. David didn't hesitate. Then you need to find him first. Richard ended the call and grabbed his coat. By the time he arrived at the Evermart location where Mark worked, the store was busy with midday customers. He scanned the aisles, looking for him, but instead spotted Lisa, one of the assistant managers, talking to a stock clerk. She turned when she saw him. Mr. Blake? Lisa, have you seen Mark? She hesitated. He left early, looked pretty shaken. Richard tensed. Shaken? Lisa glanced around, lowering her voice. Two guys came in earlier, dressed like they belonged in an office. But they weren't here to shop. They asked about Mark, wanted to know if he still worked here. Richard's pulse quickened. What did you tell them? Lisa frowned. Nothing. It felt off, so I just said I didn't know. A chill ran through Richard. Whoever these men were, they were getting closer. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. A cold, measured voice spoke. You're interfering with something bigger than you understand. Walk away. Then the line went dead. Richard gripped the phone tightly. Mark wasn't safe. And now, neither was he. He needed more than just Mark's testimony. He needed proof. That was when he remembered what David had told him. Mark wasn't the only one. David had said, another guy, Samuel Green. He had files, real proof, but he vanished years ago. If Samuel had been the one keeping records, then he was the key to exposing all of this. Richard exhaled, steeling himself. They had to find Samuel Green before Horizon Group found them. Richard sat across from Mark in a quiet corner of a diner just off the highway. The kind of place where the coffee was burnt, and the waitstaff barely looked up as they refilled your cup. It was safer than meeting anywhere tied to Evermart, especially now that they both knew they were being watched. Mark scrolled through the laptop Richard had brought, scanning military records. His brow furrowed as he stopped on a name, Samuel Green. David said this guy had proof. Richard said, keeping his voice low, files that could take Horizon Group down. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. If he's still alive. According to the records, Samuel had left the army 5 years ago, just a few months before Mark's forced discharge. He had taken a job with a private security firm, one with contracts connected to Horizon Group, but after 2 years, his name vanished from any official paperwork. No tax filings, no employment records, nothing. It was as if he had been erased. David had given them one lead, a veterans' shelter on the outskirts of town. Samuel had been spotted there a few years back before he disappeared. Richard closed the laptop. We need to find that shelter. That evening, they drove toward the city limits, the bright skyline fading in the rearview mirror as they entered a quieter, less maintained part of town. The shelter was a small, aging complex tucked between a mechanic's shop and a boarded-up grocery store. A woman in her 60s stood by the front entrance, speaking to a few men outside. Her name tag read Helen Dawson. She studied them carefully as they approached. You don't look like the type that usually comes around here, she said, eyeing Richard's tailored coat. Then she turned to Mark, noticing his military posture. But you do. Mark nodded. We're looking for someone. Samuel Green. At the mention of the name, her expression shifted, not surprise, more like hesitation. You're not the first, she finally said. A few years back, some men came around asking the same thing. They weren't friendly. Richard exchanged a glance with Mark. What happened? Helen folded her arms. Samuel was here for a while, but he left in a hurry after those men showed up. Said he couldn't stay in one place too long. Mark's jaw tightened. Did he say where he was going? She shook her head. No, but he left some things behind. I always meant to hold onto them in case he came back. She led them into a small storage room in the back of the shelter. Stacked against the walls were boxes labeled with names, belongings left behind by veterans who had either moved on or never returned. She pulled out a dusty cardboard box with Samuel's name scribbled on the side and set it on a nearby table. Inside were only a few items: an old military ID, a set of keys, a watch with a cracked face, and at the bottom, a small USB drive wrapped in a folded piece of paper. Richard unfolded the paper. An address was scrawled in rushed handwriting. A warehouse on the industrial side of town. Before they could react, Mark's phone vibrated. A blocked number. He answered. Silence for a few seconds. Then a digitized voice spoke. You should have left this alone. The call disconnected. Richard's stomach tightened. They weren't just looking for Samuel anymore. Now, someone was looking for them. Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the quiet industrial district, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The tension in the car was thick, unspoken but palpable. Mark sat in the passenger seat, silent, his gaze locked on the dimly lit buildings passing by. In the back seat, David Carter checked his firearm, the soft click of metal breaking the stillness. The address on the note from Samuel's box had led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was one of many nondescript storage facilities that lined the empty streets. But as Richard pulled into a secluded lot, he noticed subtle signs of recent activity, tire tracks in the dirt. A side door slightly ajar. They weren't the first ones here. Richard turned off the engine. We go in, find what we need, and get out, fast. Mark nodded, already scanning the area. If Samuel left anything behind, this is our best shot at proving what Horizon Group's been up to. David checked his watch. We don't have long. Let's move. They approached the warehouse cautiously, staying low as they slipped through the partially opened door. Inside, the space was cavernous, dimly lit by the glow of a few overhead bulbs that flickered sporadically. Dust and rust covered most surfaces, but some areas had been disturbed recently, footprints on the floor. A few empty coffee cups near a stack of crates. Someone had been using this place. Maybe still was. Mark moved ahead, scanning the walls, tapping on different surfaces until a hollow sound echoed back. Here, he said, stepping back. David pulled out a pocketknife and wedged it into a narrow gap between two wooden panels. With a sharp pull, a section of the wall came loose, revealing a small, rusted safe embedded into the frame. Richard stepped forward. If Samuel hid something, this has to be it. The safe was old but not impenetrable. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a compact crowbar, wedging it into the lock. After a few tense minutes of forcing and prying, the latch gave way with a metallic snap. Inside were a bundle of documents and a small external hard drive. Richard grabbed the files, flipping through them. The documents detailed fraudulent contracts, inflated costs, and off-the-books transactions linking Horizon Group to high-ranking military officials. The hard drive was labeled with a single word: accounts. This is it, Richard whispered. This is everything. Before they could celebrate, a low creak echoed through the warehouse. All three men froze. From the entrance, the sound of footsteps filled the space, steady, deliberate. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Looks like you boys found something that doesn't belong to you. A familiar voice. Richard turned slowly, and there he was, Nathan Cole. He stepped forward, flanked by three men dressed in tactical gear, their weapons partially visible under their jackets. Nathan's smirk was cold, calculating. Mark tensed beside Richard, his fists clenching. Should have figured you'd be lurking around. Nathan tilted his head. And you should have learned to stay out of things that don't concern you. He gestured lazily toward the documents in Richard's hands. I'm going to need you to hand that over. Richard tightened his grip. Not happening. Nathan sighed, nodding to his men. Then this gets messy. Mark moved first. In one swift motion, he grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground and swung, connecting with one of the men's ribs. The warehouse erupted into chaos. David shoved over a stack of crates, sending a shower of debris toward their attackers. Richard ducked as a gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off a steel beam. We need a way out, Richard shouted. Mark spotted a large propane tank near the back wall, half buried under old machinery but still intact. He exchanged a glance with David, who nodded in understanding. David fired at the base of the tank. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough. The force knocked over shelving units, sending flames licking up the walls. Nathan and his men were forced to retreat, shielding themselves from the sudden burst of heat and debris. Move. Mark grabbed Richard by the arm, dragging him toward the exit as the flames spread. They burst through the back door, running for the car as sirens began wailing in the distance. Richard barely had time to start the engine before his phone buzzed. A new message. Nathan's voice came through the speaker. You just signed your own death warrant. The game starts now. Richard parked his car in a dimly lit lot behind a nondescript office building. The adrenaline from their escape still coursed through his veins. But there was no time to dwell on it. He grabbed the duffel bag containing the documents and hard drive, then followed Mark and David into the back entrance of a law office. David had insisted they regroup there, his old firm, where he still had a few trusted allies. If Horizon Group was watching their every move, they couldn't risk using Richard's office or Mark's usual haunts. The stakes had changed. Inside, David led them to a private conference room, locking the door behind them. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Richard placed the hard drive on the table and exhaled. Let's see what we're dealing with. Mark plugged it into a laptop, fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. A series of encrypted folders popped up, followed by rows of spreadsheets, transaction logs, and emails. As he clicked through, the gravity of what they had in their hands became painfully clear. The documents detailed a sophisticated money laundering operation, funneled through military supply contracts. Funds had been rerouted through shell corporations, with payments traced to high-ranking officials in the Pentagon and private defense contractors. Then Richard saw something that made his stomach turn. Evermart's name appeared on multiple transactions. He leaned in, his pulse pounding. Some of the fraudulent payments had been funneled through accounts linked to his own company, divisions he had never personally overseen but were still under his corporate umbrella. Mark was the first to speak. "They've been using Evermart to move their money." Richard ran a hand down his face. "That means if this comes out the wrong way, it won't just take down Horizon Group. It could take down my company, too." David folded his arms. "Which is exactly why they're going to fight like hell to bury this." Silence settled over the room. Richard straightened. "We can't do this alone. We need someone with reach, someone who can get this out to the public before they can shut us down." David nodded. "I might have just the person." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. "Sarah Mitchell," she said, sounding slightly distracted. "Sarah, it's David Carter." There was a pause. "Well, that's a name I haven't heard in a while," she said. "You must have something big if you're calling me." "Bigger than you think," David replied, "and we need your help." Sarah Mitchell was a seasoned investigative journalist, known for exposing corruption at the highest levels. If anyone could take on Horizon Group, it was her. They arranged a meeting for the following evening. In the meantime, Richard reached out to a few members of Evermart's board of directors. He wanted to see if anyone would stand with him in exposing the corruption. But the responses he received were hesitant at best, dismissive at worst. "I'm sorry, Richard," one of them said, "but this is too big for us to go up against. You need to think carefully before moving forward." By the time he left his last meeting, Richard knew what that meant. No one in the company was going to help him. The only way out was through. The next night, Richard and Mark met Sarah in a private office space she sometimes used for sensitive interviews. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, with an air of confidence that only came from years of exposing powerful enemies and surviving to tell the tale. She listened as they laid out the evidence. When they finished, she exhaled slowly. "This is bigger than anything I've worked on before," she admitted, "and I've gone after senators." "Can you get it out there?" Richard asked. Sarah nodded. "If this is real, we can go public, but I need time to verify everything before I put my name on it. Give me the files, and I'll start digging." She reached for the hard drive, but before her fingers could touch it, her phone buzzed. A simple text message flashed across the screen. "Leave it alone." Then, before anyone could react, the lights in the office flickered and died. A second later, a loud crash came from the front door. Sarah's eyes widened. "They found us." Mark was already moving, yanking open a side door. "We have to go, now." Richard grabbed the hard drive as the sound of footsteps filled the hall outside. They barely made it to the emergency exit when the door burst open behind them. Two men in dark tactical gear stormed in, weapons drawn. Sarah's laptop, filled with years of notes and records, was still inside. Before they could react, a burst of flames lit up the room behind them. The files, the computers, everything Sarah had on them, gone. As they ran into the night, Richard's phone rang. "Nathan Cole." Nathan's voice was calm, almost amused. "You still think you can win this?" Richard didn't respond. Nathan chuckled. "You should have walked away. Now, you're in it for good." The line went dead. Richard clenched his jaw. There was no turning back now. Richard sat in the back of a dimly lit cafe, his fingers tapping restlessly against the edge of the table. The hard drive, their only remaining piece of evidence, sat between him and Mark. Across from them, a man in a hooded sweatshirt leaned forward, the glow of a laptop screen reflecting off his glasses. "You weren't kidding," the man muttered, scrolling through the files. "Whoever encrypted this knew what they were doing." "Can you break it?" Richard asked, his voice low. The hacker, known only as Finch, let out a dry chuckle. "I can try, But this isn't just corporate security. This is government-level encryption. You mess with this kind of stuff, and people start disappearing. Richard exchanged a glance with Mark. They already knew that all too well. We don't have a choice, Mark said. Finch sighed, cracking his knuckles before getting to work. Give me 24 hours. As they left the cafe, Mark exhaled sharply. We need more than just files. We need people. David had already started that process, using his old military contacts to track down former employees of Horizon Group, people who might be willing to testify. Most had refused, too afraid to get involved. But then a name came up. Greg Sanders, a former financial officer who had worked directly on the fraudulent contracts before suddenly resigning 2 years ago. If anyone knew the inner workings of the operation, it was him. Richard wasted no time. He called Greg's number, half expecting it to be disconnected. To his surprise, the man answered. I don't know who you are, Greg said cautiously. My name is Richard Blake. We need to talk. There was a long pause. I have nothing to say. Richard chose his next words carefully. We know what happened. We know how Horizon Group funneled money through fake contracts. And we know you were the one keeping the books. Another silence, longer this time. Then, in a hushed voice, Greg said, meet me at the old railway yard. Tonight, 9 p.m. The call ended. Richard set the phone down. He's scared. Mark nodded. That means he's telling the truth. They arrived at the meeting spot just before 9. The railway yard was abandoned, overgrown with weeds and rusted tracks. A single streetlight flickered in the distance. Then they saw him. Greg stood near a parked sedan, his posture tense. He spotted them and motioned them over. His eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. You don't know what you're getting into, Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. These people don't just bribe officials. They eliminate threats. Then why are you here? Richard asked. Greg swallowed hard. Because I can't live with it anymore. Before he could say another word, a sharp crack echoed through the night. Greg's body jerked violently before collapsing to the ground. Mark reacted first, tackling Richard behind a stack of metal crates as another shot rang out. David drew his weapon, scanning the darkness. Sniper. Richard's heart pounded. Greg lay motionless, his eyes open but lifeless. The meeting had been a setup. Mark peered over the crates, then cursed under his breath. We have to move. They sprinted toward the car, keeping low. As soon as they reached it, Richard's phone buzzed. A blocked number. A distorted voice spoke. That was your last warning. Back at Sarah Mitchell's apartment, she paced anxiously. I just got this, she said, holding up her phone. The email was simple. Stop now. Greg didn't. She looked at Richard. They're not just covering tracks. They're hunting. Richard tightened his fists. Enough was enough. If they want a war, he said, we'll give them one. Richard sat in the dimly lit back room of David's law office, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The death of Greg Sanders had proven one thing: playing defense was no longer an option. If they kept reacting, they'd be picked off one by one. It was time to take control. We can't keep hiding, Richard said, his voice firm. They want to keep this buried? Let's make it impossible for them. Mark leaned forward. How? Public exposure, Richard replied. We go loud. We take this straight to the people. Sarah Mitchell crossed her arms. You're talking about a full-on media assault. Exactly, Richard said. We find the right platform, make it live, and force them into the light. Sarah tapped her fingers against the table. Considering, if we do this through mainstream media, they'll shut it down before it even airs. Horizon Group has too many connections. We go independent, Mark suggested. Find a network they can't control. Sarah nodded slowly. I know a guy, Andrew Reynolds, runs a small but credible online news channel. He's built his reputation on exposing corporate corruption. David raised an eyebrow. Can he protect the story? Sarah exhaled. If we go live, yes. No time for them to interfere. No time for takedown orders. Richard looked at Mark. You're the one who lived it. You tell your story, and we back it up with evidence. Mark hesitated, his jaw tightening. Once I do this, there's no going back. There's no going back already, Richard said. After a long pause, Mark nodded. Then let's do it. They set the plan in motion. Sarah contacted Andrew Reynolds, who agreed to a live-streamed interview the following evening. The moment we go live, they'll come after us, Andrew warned over the phone. We're counting on it, Richard replied. The team moved quickly. David secured a safe location for the interview. And Finch, the hacker, reinforced their digital security to prevent outside interference. Everything was in place. Then it all fell apart. Late that night, Lisa, a supervisor at Evermart and one of Mark's few trusted colleagues, called him in a hushed voice. They know, she whispered. Mark sat up. What do you mean? Nathan Cole. He found out about the interview. She said, he's moving. Mark's stomach dropped. How? I don't know, Lisa admitted, but whatever you're planning, he's already one step ahead. Before Mark could respond, a second call came in. Sarah. She sounded breathless, panicked. They got to me. Richard, David, and Mark rushed to meet Sarah at a parking lot near her apartment. She was standing by her car, visibly shaken. I was followed. She motioned to the open trunk. Inside, her laptop was smashed, her camera equipment destroyed, all the documents she had printed? Gone. A single note had been left on the passenger seat. The game is over. Stop now, or you won't get another warning. Richard clenched his fists. They're trying to shut us down before we even begin. Sarah exhaled sharply. What do we do now? Richard looked at Mark, then at David. He could feel the urgency closing in on them. But one thought cut through the fear. If Nathan Cole thought the game was over, he had underestimated them. Richard sat in a dimly lit office, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. Across from him, David and Sarah watched with tense anticipation. Every decision from this point forward carried enormous risk, but they were out of options. On the other end of the line, Senator Alan Brooks listened in silence as Richard laid everything out, the fraud, the cover-ups, the murders. When Richard finished, Brooks exhaled sharply. This is bigger than I thought, he said. If we take this to the public, Horizon Group and their allies will have no place to hide. That's exactly what we need, Richard replied. A stage too big for them to silence. Brooks hesitated. Bringing this to Congress means you and everyone involved will become targets. You sure you're ready for that? Richard's grip tightened on the phone. We're already targets. Brooks was quiet for a moment, then said, all right, we do this properly. A full congressional hearing, live on national television. No one can shut it down once it's started. A plan was set. The hearing would take place in 2 days, giving Richard and his team just enough time to finalize their evidence. With the newly recovered files from Finch, they had enough proof to take Horizon Group down. But Horizon Group wasn't done yet. That night, as Mark locked up the Evermart store, he noticed something strange. A black SUV idled across the parking lot, its headlights off. He ignored it at first, but as he reached his car, the doors flung open. 2 men rushed him. Mark barely had time to react before he felt the sting of a needle in his neck. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the ground rising to meet him. Then, darkness. The next morning, Richard's phone rang. Nathan Cole's voice was calm, almost amused. Call off the hearing. Richard's stomach twisted. Where is he? Nathan chuckled. Still breathing. For now. Richard's hand curled into a fist. You won't get away with this. Oh, but I will, Nathan said smoothly, unless you want Mark to vanish forever. Richard's jaw clenched. If you touch him, I don't need to, Nathan interrupted. All you have to do is cancel your little show. No hearing, no exposé, no more digging. Do that, and Mark walks away. Richard turned to David and Sarah. They took him. David's face darkened. Then we take him back. David used his military contacts to trace the call to an industrial warehouse outside the city, the same location where Horizon Group had conducted off-the-books operations in the past. They had one shot to get Mark out alive. Richard, David, and a small team of ex-military operatives moved in under cover of darkness. The warehouse was guarded, but David's team took out the sentries silently before Richard and Sarah slipped inside. At the center of the warehouse, Mark was tied to a chair, bruised but conscious. Nathan Cole stood nearby, gun in hand, smirking. I knew you'd come. Richard stepped forward. Let him go. Nathan tilted his head. I don't think so. But let's make a deal. Walk away from the hearing. And maybe this doesn't end badly. Richard didn't hesitate. No deal. Nathan laughed. You think you're winning? I have men all over this place. You don't get out of here alive. David's voice came from behind him. Neither do you. Nathan turned just as David pressed a gun to his back. For the first time, Nathan's smirk faltered. Drop it, David ordered. Nathan hesitated, then dropped his weapon. Mark took the opportunity. With a sudden twist of his chair, he kicked Nathan off balance and tackled him to the ground. Richard grabbed Nathan's gun and aimed it squarely at him. You lost, Richard said. With Nathan captured and Mark freed, they handed him over to Brooks's federal contacts. Horizon Group's enforcer was finally out of the picture. But Richard knew this wasn't over. Nathan was just a piece of the puzzle. The real power was still out there. As they drove back to the city, Mark turned to Richard. This won't stop them. Richard nodded. No, but tomorrow, the world will finally know the truth. The morning of the congressional hearing was unlike any other Richard had experienced. The weight of what was coming sat heavily on his shoulders. Across the city, news outlets were already covering the buildup, speculation, counter-arguments, and attempts to discredit Mark's testimony had flooded every major channel. Sarah Mitchell was relentless. Hours before the hearing, she went live with an exclusive exposé, detailing everything they had uncovered. Her broadcast spread across social media, forcing the conversation into the public eye. If Horizon Group thought they could suppress this, they were wrong. Still, the counterattack had already begun. By midday, several media outlets controlled by Horizon Group began discrediting the allegations, calling them fabricated and suggesting that Richard had personal motives to destroy a competing corporation. Fake reports were pushed online claiming that Mark was an unstable former soldier with a vendetta against the military. And worst of all, one of their key witnesses had just backed out, silenced by money. Threats, or worse. Richard tightened his tie in front of the mirror. They were trying to control the story. But today, the story wasn't theirs to tell. The hearing chamber was packed. Cameras lined the walls, flashing as Richard, Mark, and David stepped inside. The energy in the room was tense, half the attendees watching in silent anticipation, the other half waiting for them to fail. At the center of it all sat the defense team for Horizon Group. A row of their best lawyers in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. Seated beside them was Gerald Whitmore, CEO of Horizon Group. He looked completely composed, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience. His confidence was unsettling. Senator Alan Brooks called the session to order. This hearing is now in session. We are here today to investigate allegations of financial misconduct, fraud, and corporate corruption within Horizon Group and its military contracts. The room fell silent. Brooks turned to Mark. Mr. Evans, please state your name and affiliation for the record. Mark leaned into the microphone. His voice was clear, steady. Mark Evans, former logistics officer, U.S. Army. He took a breath, and then, he told his story. He walked them through the entire nightmare, his discovery of the fraud, the evidence he found, and the systematic efforts to silence him. He described the false charges that led to his discharge, the men who followed him, and how Horizon Group manipulated military contracts to funnel billions into private accounts. The room remained eerily quiet as he finished. Then, it was Richard's turn. He presented the financial documents Finch had restored from the hard drive. Transaction records, internal emails, hidden accounts, proof that Evermart had unknowingly been used as a shell company to move illicit funds. For the first time, Whitmore shifted in his seat. Then came the counterattack. A woman in a sleek black suit, Horizon Group's lead attorney, stood up. Mr. Evans, she began, her voice sharp. Isn't it true that you were dishonorably discharged? Mark kept his expression neutral. That's what the paperwork says. So, she continued, why should we believe the words of a disgraced soldier with an alleged vendetta against his former employers? Richard clenched his fists. They were trying to bury him in doubt. Then, a bigger blow came. One of their key witnesses, a former Horizon executive, retracted his statement. I can no longer verify the authenticity of the documents presented, he said, reading from a prepared statement. I believe the accusations made here today are speculative at best. A murmur ran through the chamber. The media whispered, Horizon had gotten to him. Sarah, watching from the sidelines, looked like she wanted to scream. Whitmore's lawyers pressed further. If the witness was unreliable, how could any of this evidence be trusted? For a moment, Richard felt the momentum slipping. Then, the twist they never saw coming. The doors to the chamber opened, and a court officer hurried in, whispering something into Senator Brooks's ear. Brooks nodded, then turned to the room. "We have just received new evidence," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Due to its significance, I am allowing it to be presented immediately." A video file appeared on the large monitor in the room. The footage was grainy, dimly lit, but the voice was unmistakable. Tied to a chair in an interrogation room, his face bruised, his voice strained but clear. "This whole thing," he muttered, "it goes higher than you think." Whitmore knew. He knew everything. He signed off on every payment, every false contract. "You want the truth? Start with him." The room erupted. Whitmore's lawyers jumped to their feet. "Objection. This is highly irregular." Brooks slammed his gavel. "The witness will remain silent." Whitmore's face had drained of color. For the first time, he looked afraid. And then, the real chaos began. The media exploded. Reporters scrambled. Headlines were already flashing across screens. CEO implicated in military fraud scandal. Secret recordings reveal corporate cover-up. The hearing descended into chaos as officials scrambled to address the bombshell. Security stepped in to escort Whitmore away. But the damage was done. Horizon Group was exposed. Richard exhaled. They had done it. But as he looked around the room, he realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much bigger war. The morning after the hearing, Richard sat in his office, staring at his inbox. It had been flooded with reactions from every direction, some congratulating him, others warning him. The fallout from the hearing was immediate. News outlets dissected Nathan Cole's confession. But already, Horizon Group's allies were pushing back. The first attack came from political figures who had deep ties to the defense industry. The so-called evidence presented yesterday is purely circumstantial. A senator declared on live television, "We must be cautious before allowing baseless accusations to damage the reputation of trusted institutions." Richard clenched his jaw. They were trying to stall the investigation. At the same time, Evermart's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The company's stock had dropped 8% overnight, and investors were furious. Richard barely had time to sit down before the head of the board, Charles Dempsey, started speaking. "We need to talk about damage control," Dempsey said, his tone clipped. "Evermart has been dragged into a battle that was never ours to fight." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Evermart was used as a front for money laundering. That makes it our fight." A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Dempsey sighed. "We understand your position, Richard, but there are alternatives. We received a proposal this morning from an anonymous investor group willing to buy out your shares at a very generous price." Richard's stomach tightened. "A buyout?" Dempsey nodded. "They're offering double the market value." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Richard understood. "This isn't an investor group," he said. "This is Horizon Group, or one of their proxies." No one denied it. Dempsey folded his hands on the table. "Look, Richard, everyone has a price. They're giving you a way out. Take it, and this problem disappears." Richard exhaled slowly, then stood up. "That's your advice? Take the money and walk away?" Dempsey met his gaze. "It's business. You don't win wars against people like them." Richard shook his head. "Then maybe you've been fighting the wrong wars." He turned and walked out. Meanwhile, Mark sat in Sarah's newsroom, watching the broadcast replay of the hearing. His face was everywhere now. Headlines, interviews, online discussions. And yet, he felt emptier than ever. He had fought so hard for this. Exposing the truth was supposed to bring closure. But it didn't. Sarah sat down next to him. "You okay?" Mark sighed. "I don't know." She nodded slowly. "You did something incredible. You gave people the truth." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "And now what?" "I still don't have my life back." She hesitated, then said, "Maybe you're not supposed to go back. Maybe this is your new fight." Mark looked at her. For the first time, he realized he wasn't the same man who had been discharged years ago. He wasn't running anymore. That night, Richard received an email. Anonymous sender. No subject. Inside was a single line. You made the wrong choice. Attached was a financial report, showing that Evermart was about to lose millions. Richard exhaled. They were punishing him for refusing the buyout. But they had underestimated him. The next morning, Richard held a press conference. In front of reporters, cameras, and employees, he made a declaration. Effective immediately, Evermart will be terminating all contracts connected to Horizon Group and their affiliates. This company will no longer be used as a tool for corruption. It was a financially dangerous move, but a necessary one. Horizon Group had played their last card, and Richard had burned the table down. Days later, arrests began. Several executives from Horizon Group were charged. Investigations into military procurement corruption were expanded. The government could no longer ignore what had been exposed. But Richard knew the truth. They had won this battle. But the war wasn't over. The morning after Richard's announcement, the stock market responded exactly as he had expected, but that didn't make it easier to watch. Evermart's shares had dropped by 12% overnight, wiping out millions in shareholder value. The headlines weren't kind. Evermart CEO's reckless gamble tanks stock. Corporate suicide? Richard Blake cuts ties with key defense partners. And the pressure was only beginning. Richard entered the Evermart headquarters knowing what was coming. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting, and the air in the conference room was thick with frustration. Charles Dempsey, the head of the board, wasted no time. Richard, what the hell were you thinking? Richard remained standing at the far end of the table. I was thinking about protecting this company from being part of a criminal enterprise. Dempsey scoffed, and in doing so, you've dragged us into a financial disaster. The investors are furious. Our partnerships are in jeopardy. We're hemorrhaging money. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Another board member, a woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes, spoke next. We've been contacted by several major shareholders. They want you to step down. Richard expected this. And what happens if I refuse? Dempsey leaned forward. Then the board will have no choice but to hold a vote of no confidence. Silence settled in the room. Richard exhaled slowly, looking around at the men and women who had once trusted his leadership. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about power. He had known that taking on Horizon Group would have consequences. But losing Evermart? That was personal. Still, he wasn't about to fold. I built this company, Richard said evenly. I've given my life to it. And I won't let it be a tool for corruption. Dempsey's expression hardened. Then you need to consider the damage you're causing. Not just to yourself, but to everyone here. Richard met his stare. I have, and I won't back down. The meeting ended without a resolution. The board would deliberate, but Richard knew what was coming. Across town, Mark sat in a small cafe, scrolling through the news. His face was everywhere. The hero who had taken on corruption. The whistleblower who had exposed a conspiracy. But also, the disgraced soldier who had stirred unnecessary trouble. Some articles praised him, others tore him apart. Ex-soldier exploits military past for fame. Mark Evans. A man seeking revenge. Not justice? He clenched his jaw, setting his phone down. The weight of it all was crushing. Sarah Mitchell sat across from him, studying him carefully. Don't let them get in your head. Mark exhaled. I knew this would happen. But knowing and feeling it are two different things. Sarah leaned forward. Do you have any idea how many veterans have reached out to me because of you? People who finally feel like someone spoke up for them. Mark hesitated. And what if it's not enough? David Carter, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. Then you keep going. The truth is messy, Mark, but it's still the truth. Mark nodded slowly. Maybe they were right. Maybe this wasn't just about him anymore. That night, Richard received an unexpected visitor. A man in an expensive charcoal suit sat across from him in his office. His name was Elliot Grayson, a senior executive from Vanguard Holdings, a powerful financial firm. We understand that Evermart is under significant pressure, Grayson said smoothly, and we'd like to offer you a way out. Richard folded his arms. I'm listening. Grayson slid a folder across the desk. A full buyout of your shares. At triple the current market price. Richard raised an eyebrow. That's generous. We believe Evermart has value. Grayson said, But we also believe its current leadership is making decisions that aren't in the company's best interests. Richard smirked. And I assume you'd install your leadership? Grayson didn't blink. Of course. We'd restructure the board, restore investor confidence, and, most importantly, move past this entire scandal. Richard leaned back, studying the offer. If he took the deal, he could walk away clean. No more battles, no more threats, no more watching the company he built crumble around him. But then what? Let another power-hungry corporation come in and sweep everything under the rug? Allow Evermart to become just another cog in the machine of corruption? Grayson studied him carefully. Everyone has a price. Richard met his gaze. Then you should have done your research. Grayson's smile faded. He stood, buttoning his jacket. Think it over. Just don't take too long. Richard watched him leave, knowing this wasn't the last offer he'd receive. Richard sat alone in his office long after Grayson had gone. He had spent his entire life building Evermart. And now, he had to decide if it was worth sacrificing everything to fight for what was right. Was he willing to lose it all? Or would he walk away? The choice was his. The boardroom was silent. All eyes were on Richard as he stood at the head of the long oak table. The tension in the air was thick. Every executive in the room had been waiting for his response. After a long pause, Richard finally spoke. I'm not selling. Murmurs erupted around the table. Some directors exchanged nervous glances, while others sighed in frustration. Charles Dempsey, who had been the most vocal about removing Richard, clenched his jaw. Richard, be reasonable. This company is bleeding. We need stability. Richard met his stare. Stability built on corruption isn't stability at all. Dempsey exhaled sharply. Then you leave us no choice. He glanced at the other board members before pushing his chair back. I resign. One by one, several directors followed suit, standing and walking out of the room. Richard watched them go without saying a word. He had expected this. But not everyone left. A few remained. Individuals who had been silent until now, who now looked at him with something new in their eyes. Respect. One of them, a younger woman named Elaine Parker, leaned forward. I believe in what you're doing, Richard, and I know investors who would, too. Richard nodded slowly. Then let's rebuild this company the right way. Evermart was no longer just his legacy. It was his statement. Across town, Mark stood outside a small brick building with a faded sign that read Veterans Outreach Initiative. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and paper. A few men and women in military fatigues sat in chairs, some talking quietly, others staring into space. A man in his late 50s approached him, extending a hand. Mark Evans, we've been waiting for you. Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure he belonged here. The man, David Morales, a former Marine, seemed to sense his doubt. I read your story. A lot of guys here did. He glanced around the room. We could use someone like you. Mark took a breath. What exactly do you need? Morales smiled. Someone to remind them they're not alone. Mark thought about everything he had been through. The fight for truth, the struggle to be heard, the feeling of being discarded. And then, he nodded. Maybe this was what he had been looking for all along. Nathan Cole's trial was swift and unforgiving. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His ties to Horizon Group, his role in the cover-up, his threats against Mark and Richard. The judge handed down the maximum sentence. Other key players in the corruption scheme also faced charges. A few high-ranking military officials were indicted. Some corporate executives fled the country. But not everyone was held accountable. Richard knew that some of the most powerful figures were still in the shadows, untouched. For now. Late one evening, as Richard was preparing to leave his office, his assistant handed him an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Every battle is just the beginning." And beneath it, a single handwritten line, "You won this time, but are you ready for what comes next?" Richard stared at the words, his grip tightening on the paper. Then, slowly, he looked out the window of his office. The city stretched before him, bright, alive, and full of secrets still waiting to be uncovered. He knew the fight wasn't over. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. At the heart of this story lies a simple but powerful truth. Real leadership isn't just about profits. It's about people. Richard could have turned away, taken the easy road, but instead, He chose to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. And Mark? He proved that even when the world tries to silence you, the truth is always worth fighting for. But here's the question. How many more stories like this are out there? Still hidden in the shadows? How many voices are waiting to be heard? If you believe in exposing the truth, in standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths. Because sometimes, the biggest battles start with the smallest discoveries. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.